Thanks, everybody. Appreciate you taking some time out to talk to us and hang out with us. And really kind of maybe you know a lot about Sysmon, maybe you're just new to it. Really want to level set kind of really why I did this is just an update last month, late June, less than a month ago on Sysmon and two real big pieces that came out of that. And I thought it'd be, oh, hey, this is a really good opportunity to start talking about how we can augment some of our incident investigations with Sysmon. So we'll go ahead. Before real quick introduction myself, I've been in the industry plus over a decade. Prior to that, I spent some time in law enforcement and worked cybercrime there. That's where I got my first real taste of digital forensics and incident response. And been working in the industry for about a decade now. I'm based out of Rapid City, South Dakota. And I currently, my day job is with a managed detection and response provider. I'll give you a hint. They just released an integration with backdoors and breaches just recently. I was not part of that, but working a similar team doing readiness and working with organizations to make sure that when the inevitable or the worst case scenario happens, they're not really caught off guard. So real quick, what are we talking about? We're talking about System Monitor or Sysmon. I'm just going to shorten it for Sysmon as part of this. Essentially, it is a service that runs and device driver that basically will survive reboot, and it monitors system activity on the Windows system, on the Windows endpoint. This is Microsoft's definition. Obviously, I tossed the link in there for everybody to share. But what it really is some serious visibility into the endpoint behavior that we normally don't get through, say, Windows security, Windows RDP, those kind of log files. Those log files are very good, but it's often difficult from an incident investigation perspective to start aggregating and deconflicting and trying to normalize all of those log sources. So one of the things that I like to do is use Sysmon as kind of a first stop for some Windows behavior. And there's a variety of Windows behavior we're going to look at, from an executable fires off to a registry write to a DNS query to a file gets deleted. So think of this as a system monitor. Now, obviously, this is a system's internal tool. It doesn't ship with the Windows operating system. It's something you do have to install and configure, but don't let that frighten you, because it's a fairly trivial matter to get this up and running. So we talk about some of the capabilities that we don't get in terms of what we would have from event logs, just straight up, say, security. And I'm not saying those are bad. I'm not saying that we don't use them in incident investigations. But again, Sysmon is a really good place to start digging in very quickly, to start getting some sense, some indicators around behavior, threat actor or otherwise, that go on the system. A couple of things that I want to point out, you can play with this yourself, is process creation is one of the big ones. When we start looking actually at some of the log entries and actually some of the techniques that are used, if I'm looking for, say, the run DLL 32 proxy bypass to execute a DLL file, very tough to uncover, but something like Sysmon, event ID 1, bang, I got it right there, as opposed to having to go into, say, shimcache or amcache parsing or see if prefetch files are available. The other major data point that we can actually leverage with Sysmon that we generally don't get with others is DNS and network connection. And these kind of combinations of all of these things really provide us insight into, say, malicious code or even low bin activity that we generally don't get with other logs without having to go through a large amount of processing. And one of the things that I want to really kind of cover today is an actual flow of how to actually go ahead and start looking at, say, Sysmon logs on a system. This can also be tailored. So one of the things that I really enjoy about this industry is the amount of open source tools and open source configs, YAML files for Yara rules, Sigma rules, all of that. Same thing here. Because Sysmon is essentially a free tool by Microsoft, it's a system's internal tool, and you can use a variety of configurations. We'll talk about that a little bit. You can actually tailor a configuration to what you want to do. And that is kind of what we're going to talk about. We're going to look at some log files that are exceptionally verbose and what they tell us, and even tie and map to MITRE attack techniques, all things that can be done. And there's a wide variety of different configs that you can use here. This is a good first starting point, but it is also a really good integration with other data sources. So for example, what I teach in the course is looking at 3 or 4 data sources to really kind of capture a good picture. But we often lack a starting point, and sometimes the prefetch may not be available. If it is a new Windows operating system on a laptop, it may not be enabled. So we have to go somewhere else, and diving into the master file table to find an executable that was placed on the file system within the last day may be very difficult to sort through all of those MFTs, whereas Sysmon, it's a fairly, I'm not going to say it's easy, but it's not as difficult as going into some of the more robust data sources. So I talked about an update, just updated to version 15 that's just dropped the last month or so. Not really too exciting in terms of bug fixes. It's obviously it's a Windows systems internal tool. It's a Windows tool. Everything's got bugs. No real surprise there. But there's 2 things that are very important with this update, and that's first is Sysmon will now run as a protected process. So essentially, if you look at version 14 and below, it was very easily disableable. You can go in there, and threat actors could go in there and easily take care of it, or destroy it, stop it, however you want to put it, but basically mess with your ability to log on that file. So Windows has provided a little bit of protection around the process, as the normal PPL from a Windows perspective. That's important. Kind of helps us a little bit with some of that, say, anti-forensics or some of the other threat actor behavior if they really are trying to maintain a cover. The new one I talked about, alluding to the master file table, is the file executable detected is a new event ID. And what this will tell us is if a new executable has been placed on the file system, not executed, but placed on the file system. And what that does for us is, if we need to look at threat actor behavior where they're moving some of the tools in, whether it's a low bin or code that is brought into the environment as maybe a second or tertiary stage of their attack. So for example, we're going to look at Bloodhound or Sharphound as the executable that's pulled in to map an Active Directory environment. If that's pulled in and just placed on the file system and not executed, we didn't see that. So we may have cut off threat actor behavior and not realize that they had brought additional tool set in there. And if we're trying to clean up systems to redeploy, we may have left some of their tooling behind. So this is really one of the 2 major changes, but that file executable detected really helps us with that understanding of additional tool sets that were brought in, maybe not executed, or maybe we see a date and timestamp when those things are brought in, and we can start to look at a much more granular timeline of threat actor activity. So here's the good and the bad with Sysmon. I like to kind of, there's no perfect solutions, there's only trade-offs. This does give us, from the good perspective, deep visibility into endpoint behavior. This is things that you would not normally get with the disparate amount of Windows event logging. It really puts this all in one place, and it does give us a lot of visibility into what's actually going on. Verbose logs, as I said, with the configurations, we can get additional insight into what's going on. We can combine Sysmon logs with other logs to actually look at activity on the endpoint, and then maybe couple that with security logs where we're seeing 4624, type 3, type 5, type 10 type of activity, people logging in, local systems, all of those things. It's also a really good first step in a triage process, and the ability to actually start to gain some real insight as what happened on an endpoint, within that time period. Here's the flip side. It's very loud. So it logs lots of legitimate behavior as well. So if you are saying, hey, can I pull this into a SIM? Yes, you can. Absolutely. If you want to fire up Splunk or fire up Elastic and pull in Sysmon, you can do it. Little quick experiment I did in preparation for this. I did that, let it run for about 24 hours, and it had 15,000 event log entries from a single system. And I wasn't even doing anything on that system. I was playing around with it, doing some of the prep here in the lab system, but it had about 14,000 to 15,000 log entries in a 24-hour period. So that is really a lot of data that you're going to have to play with. And we'll talk later on about a strategy when we wrap up about how to actually leverage this to the best of ability. If you can pull in Sysmon into a SIM, I'm jealous. But if you take 2,000 systems in a say a standard medium enterprise, you're talking a lot of data that's being pulled in. So something to think about. It does capture a lot of legitimate behavior. So you think all of those process execution, all of those pipes, all of those DNS queries, those are legitimate. So it's not an alerting mechanism. It is strictly like, hey, this is what's going on in the endpoint. So there's lots of legitimate behavior that gets tied in that. And that can actually make it very difficult to craft, say, alerts in your SIM. So if you're alerting every time, say, event ID 1, a new process is created, you're going to get buried. But as I said, it's difficult, not impossible. There's ways to do it so that you can actually see some sort of behaviors that might be indicative of threat actor activity. So we'll talk real quick about the configuration and setup. This is fairly simple to do. Really, the first thing you need to do, and all of the links are right here and what I use, you just download Sysmon from the Microsoft site. It has to be unzipped, and essentially you've got Sysmon now. And select a configuration. Now, there are configurations. I've put a few different resources at the back of this presentation. We'll be sharing out later, and it will have different resources. You can Google Sysmon configuration files. I prefer Olaf's Sysmon config. I think it's one of the best in terms of demonstrating the capabilities and actually using it in, say, some of the other use cases that we haven't even touched on is using it in a malware sandbox. He has some that are seriously verbose that I would never run in a production environment, but if I was testing out or executing or detonating malware in a controlled environment, will give you a lot of good data in there. All you do is from the command line, you run Sysmon. This is step 3. I give you the command to actually go in there, and basically you point Sysmon to a configuration file. It reads the configuration file. It says, yes, this is a good config file, and I'm going to just start doing what you tell me to in the config file. You just have to accept the end user licensing agreement, and you're off and running. If you are doing this, say, in some environment where you want to maximize the Sysmon log file size, I toss that command down there as a separate a one-off command. Something to think about if you want to. So this increases it to just 20 megabytes of data. So if you think about, and this is something to look at, I would recommend is see how much you have in terms of data. I think I've got about 3 to 4 or 5 days worth of data. It's more than enough, say, to investigate some detection that you get on a system. So all things to think about. This is a fairly straightforward process. Does not take a lot. What I would say is start playing with different configs. The other thing is you can do with this is you can go into the task manager, stop Sysmon, find a new config, rerun Sysmon, it'll load that new config, and you're off and running. So something to think about too. It doesn't take too much to go in and start working with different configs. So one of the other things that you will often have an issue with, say in the let's say in the last 3 or 4 years, something happened and all of a sudden everybody's gone remote. If you have an agent, this is from Velociraptor. Velociraptor actually has a remote install tool. So if you are running Velociraptor, say in your environment, and what you can do is actually use Swift on Security's config and the binary, and it'll install it for you. And then we can start actually pulling in log files and doing all of these kind of things remotely. So we don't actually have to actually touch the system. Sysmon can be also deployed, SCCM, Landesk, anything else that can deploy an MSI or something of that nature. So again, remote install, I throw this in here because sometimes, you want to play around in a lab and just do it. There is a artifact in Velociraptor that allows you to use the remote install. So I'm going to back out of here, and we're actually going to go ahead and go into a system, and I'm actually going to walk through some of the triage steps and how to actually work with this in, say, Velociraptor and on an actual endpoint. What I've gone ahead and done is run some atomic red team tests on a system, and I've included those as part of the resources at the back, the actual test that I ran. And you should see just a normal Windows desktop here. And we're going to go ahead into Velociraptor here. And very simply, what we're going to look at is first how to actually triage Sysmon from Velociraptor. And I use this as it's a good standalone tool. For example, the 2-day class, I think there's a few anti-siphon instructors that are making heavy use of Velociraptor. One, because it's an awesome tool. Two, because it's free and open source still. So it's a really good resource. And three, it stands in for a lot of other EDR type platforms that will do evidence collection. So we use that as kind of a stand-in in a lot of ways. This doesn't mean you cannot run Velociraptor in a enterprise environment. You totally can. It's scalable, and it has a lot of functionality. But the first thing to think about is, hey, I have an alert, something that happens in the environment, and I need to take care of it, and I want some quick visibility. There is a quick visibility here, and what I'm going to do is just open up a new collection here. And I'll show you some of the Sysmon artifact collectors. One other thing that I neglected to talk about, and it's kind of outside the scope of what we're talking about today, is this is available for Linux as well. So if you're running a lot of cloud systems or Linux in your environment, there is a Sysmon that works with Linux. But what you have down here is a triage. This is the Windows triage.sysmon artifact in Velociraptor. What it does is it collects all of the Sysmon event log entries for a specified time period. So the user will specify. The default is 600 seconds, so 10 minutes. But if you need to go back an hour, you need to go back 2 hours, you need to go back 3 hours, you can do that. You can just say 1200 seconds or 1800 seconds, something of that nature. That gives you that, maybe 10, 20, 30 minutes of data. I would say if you're starting to go over a day, you might want to pull this out entirely and then parse it out a different way. But this is a really good way to start looking at the log files for that. You can set that. So we're going to leave it at 10 minutes just to see what we got. I've not run any of the atomic red team tests on this system. We're just going to see what we get and then move from there. So we're just going to launch that. And what we should see is it's doing its thing. It's doing its thing. It's thinking. It's thinking. And we've got 59 results in terms of event logs in the last 10 minutes. So you can see how we're very quickly getting into that 14, 15,000 territory if in the last 10 minutes. And that's fairly small when you look at it. So if we go ahead and we look at the results, we actually have the ability now to look at each individual Sysmon log entry in Velociraptor. So we're not even downloading this. We're not doing any of the triage analysis that we'll talk about later on. We're just doing this as a first step. Hey, this is what's happened on an endpoint last 10 minutes, according to Sysmon. So, and we can filter on these IDs. We can sort by time, but let's just go ahead and 3. And this is just a network connection. So if you think about, say, command and control activity, you may be able to see it with some of this visibility in terms of Sysmon. So we have event ID 3, and I would recommend going through. I didn't want to take too much time up going through all of the different event IDs, but what we are seeing is, yeah, we've got the visibility into IP address, source destination. Now this is just an internal Chrome thing, but as you see, all of this different information that's coming in. So this is all stuff that we can start just looking at, and 59 entries is not necessarily the worst thing in the world. The other option we do have with any results in Velociraptor is the ability to download just these 59 in the last 10 minutes. So that's an option as well. I find it sometimes gets a little difficult to work in Velociraptor because of the screen size and how it's laid out. It takes a little different, and I'm actually going to demonstrate the next stage that you might want to talk about or do, and that is looking at taking all the logs and doing some sort of triage analysis in there. So let's go ahead and pivot from here and talk collection. Now, there's a couple of ways to collect the Sysmon logs. If you saw the anti-cast that I did in May, I talked about triage and triage data. What you'll see is we talked about cape files for the Kroll artifact and the Kroll artifact parser and extractor tool set. So in the cape files, in the basic collection, are all of the event logs. So if you just did a basic collection, going back to some of the discussions we had there, we workflow a basic collection through cape, and we're going to get these logs, if you've got them enabled, on an endpoint via Velociraptor. Now, you're getting a lot of obviously all sorts of other data involved. So if you're strictly looking at the log files themselves, just Sysmon, there is a way to do that. So we don't necessarily need to go through and do a full on pulling triage data down. We can actually do this fairly simply by just going to the file system. And in Velociraptor, for this system that I'm connected to, so I'm remotely connected to the system, I can go to the virtual file system. And where these live is at the C, go to Windows, System 32. And where to go here? Win event, logs, and these are all of the log files I talked about. So we have 164 different log sources in here. So we're going to have to go ahead and find the Sysmon. Internet Explorer. So this may take you a few seconds to go through this. This is going to be a little while here. Wish there was a search function. But one of the things, if you run into this, it's getting too much, you can. Yep, that's the raw JSON. Stand by 1 second, people. Sorry about that. Is over here. Give me 1 second while I find this here. I can't seem to find it here. I had it before. Hold on one second. Sorry, everybody. Well, without taking up too much time, but essentially what we can do is actually extract all of the log files, or however we want to do this. Instead of working with too much of this, is I'll go through how to actually pull these into a oh, hold on, there we are. So sorry about that. It took me a second to find these. This is one of those things. So one of the things we can do is we found the log files that we want, the Sysmon operational, and we can just collect those from the system. And what we should see here is this is where we've got our data. This is the downloaded file. So to kind of tie this together, my apologies, it took me a second to find the actual log files. What I've done is I've just grabbed those files and placed them in Velociraptor where we can download. So what I like to do is just download the file, and this is just going to be the Sysmon logs, and then we can get out of Velociraptor and actually work in our file system. So what we've done here is downloaded these files. I'm going to extract, and I'll show you exactly what we have to work with. And here are the Sysmon operational logs from our target system. All right, so we've got some activity on a system. We've gone ahead and pulled those down. What we want to do is put these in a state that we can quickly go through them and work directly with the data in there. I am not a huge fan of the Windows event viewer for this process until I need to actually dial into some of the actual suspect log entries. But one of the things that I like to do is convert this into a CSV file that I can use the best digital forensics tool out there, which is a spreadsheet, whether it's LibreOffice or Microsoft Excel, something of that nature that I can actually work with. So what we're going to do is actually going to convert this into a CSV file. And how I'm going to do that is to use some of the tools that we talked about in the last Anticast and start working with some of the extractors from the Eric Zimmerman tool set to actually place this into a CSV. So give me 1 second and I'll just type out the command here. So what I'm doing is I've put these into the suspect log directory on the desktop. I'm pointing this, the EVTX extractor. What it's going to do is it's going to take each log entry and give it a single line in a CSV file. And this will allow me to actually go ahead and sort and work through, say, something like LibreOffice, which is going to be the next step. So we're going to go ahead and fire that off. Supposed to fire off. There we go. So while it's processing, let's kind of talk about a workflow. This is really a way to extract those logs. Took us a little time to find them, but we found them. we're going to go ahead and extract them and actually start to look at the different log entries that we have here. The other thing that I like to do is when you look at the spread, these are the different event IDs that are contained within the log files. So you can see a lot of different activity, but some may be something that you see, hey, there's only one of these. Why is that? And that may give you some point to look at. But look at just in the last, these logs are only about 4 or 5 days old, and we already have 1,100 event ID ones, which are that basically that process is created. So let's go over here. Now we have the Sysmon. This is our CSV output. And what I'm going to do is, instead of opening it with Notepad, I'm going to actually open it up with LibreOffice here. The reason I like to do this, for me personally, there's other ways to do it where you can input into, say, a timeline explorer, or you can put it into something else. This allows me to really look at, it really allows me to look at the different log entries and sort through just using filter commands. Also, I can take out a lot of this extraneous information without having to really deal with it. So I really don't need user ID. I don't need the system. But here I'm looking at all of the different log entries here by time. And this gives me some ability to parse through these and really look at some of the data here. So give me 1 second, and what we can do is start filtering on things. You can filter on, say, event ID, and I'm concerned about, say, internet activity, DNS queries, so 22. And right now I've got all of the DNS queries that are going out. So I might start looking, let's say I'm hunting command and control traffic. And what I'm looking for is maybe applications that just stand out. You know, OneDrive is going to make some sort of network communications understandable. Microsoft Edge, all of these other types. But you're starting to see, here's one right here, PowerShell. And what you also see is a lot of the same DNS activity within a very close time of each other. So if I was looking at this, I might say, hey, that's kind of weird. That may, and PowerShell's doing it. I may have to go look for PowerShell activity on the system, and we can actually look at where that traffic is going. So I may have just identified command and control traffic. I may have just identified a command and control beacon just by literally extracting these, dumping these into a spreadsheet, and actually starting to parse through them in a matter of maybe 5 to 10 minutes. I can take exactly that kind of activity and start to look at activity that would be threat actor, something that really stands out very quickly. Same thing with, and we'll look at some of these other log entries as they're standalone, but this really kind of contextualizes what's happening on the system. Now, if I back out of here and just do everything, then I'm really getting a sense of what's going on the system. I'm saying, okay, so we've got some process creations, and then we got a DNS event, some more process creation, DNS. And I'll tell you, this is just me installing things, but it does look like something is going on here. And as you start to drill down into the different lines, you can really start to look at additional where we're seeing process execution with a network connection. Something to think about too is if I'm firing up something like a Cobalt Strike beacon, I'm going to see some of that activity in the same general time period. Now, if I back all the way out, then I can see some. You can actually see where installing Sysmon. But we start to see registry writes. We start to see this activity. So if you think about how, say, malware gets onto a system and then it starts to actually execute some sort of behavior, and then it maybe makes a beacon out to command and control infrastructure to download a secondary payload and then do some other activity right to the registry. All of this information is being captured right here in the Sysmon logs. Let's go ahead and analyze a few different techniques. As I said in the slides, which I'm going to be sharing, there's actually the log entries for, I should say not the log entries, but the actual atomic red team tests that I executed as part of this demonstration, so you can actually see them. So let's go ahead and I'm going to punch up a few here so you get a sense of kind of what malicious activity looks like inside a inside the Sysmon logs. As I said, I'm not a huge fan of Event Viewer because it is kind of somewhat cumbersome to work with, but for our purposes in the demo, if you've got something else, if you like Event Log Explorer, a tool that I highly recommend, that's a really good one to actually use too, because you can use different configs and really highlight some things that you're looking for. So let's kind of look at a process execution. So the test I actually ran on this was essentially, this is an initial access attack. And what it does is it reaches out to GitHub and pulls down data as a secondary stage, basically pulls the script down from GitHub. So if you think about threat actors that may be hosting additional code or additional tools in GitHub or some other internet-based command and control framework, this is a straight up DNS query. So if we're looking, say, at initial access as a tactic, we're like trying to figure out how they got in, we're not going to see the email that maybe the chief financial officer or somebody in payroll got, but what we will see potentially is that DNS query that was used as part of the script to go out, reach out, and grab some additional code down on GitHub. Or this literally may be the initial stage. This may be the initial stage of like, so now we have an actual IOC. What I would do with this IOC is then go back to, say, Blue Coat or some sort of web proxy, whether you're using Umbrella, Blue Coat, or something, and say, hey, did anybody else go out to here? So as I said, we're talking in a matter of minutes. We're pulling out some IOCs to look at. And this is the actual test. And if you follow along, as I said, I gave you the tests, you can actually see this if you use that config that we set up earlier. So this gives you some insight, say, that initial stage. I talked earlier about a proxy bypass, that run DLL. What does that look like in Sysmon? Well, it's a good question. So let's go ahead and look at that. So I'm looking at just all the process create event IDs. That's 1,100, close to 1,200. So again, going back to our earlier discussion, it may be difficult to profile all of these. But if I start to look at, no, that's not it. If I start to look at, so here's one where you might see, this is a very common technique where you see WMI being used as to execute in terms of a proxy or in terms to execute code on a system. I talked about the actual config, and Olaf actually puts the technique in there that actually is executed as part of this attack. So something to think about too is that gives us some additional insight into what's actually going on there. There's also additional, so this is WMI is executing, So this is a common technique that you will see. It's actually in the top 10 of techniques that a lot of the MDR providers are seeing. There's actually another ID that we can look at, and that's with event ID 7, which gives us insight specifically into WMI. So let me see here. That's not it. Okay. As I said, common technique, but we can start to see some of that. Hey, this is how the threat actor got onto the network. Then they're executing this type of code, or you might just have code yourself and you want to see what it does. This might be a good way to actually work with it. So this is me attacking. So we talked also about what are the hashes, file name, the DLL. So if you've got run DLL, or in this case, we're executing a DLL file, it also gives you the hash values too. So you can actually dump this out, SHA-256, SHA-1. You can actually start to look at pulling this out as another indicator and start to work with that. So again, now we've got hash values. We have a DNS entry. We've got all sorts of information that we're starting to pivot off of just by looking at behavior on the endpoint. So in this case, we've got some WMI activity where they're using that to execute, and they're actually using that to gain some level of execution and maybe persistence in the environment. Let's talk about one of the last ones that we talked, and there's a few others within the slides to look at, but one of the things that has changed with Sysmon that I definitely want to talk about is this executable that's put on the system. So file executable detected. So this is not an executable executed. This is somebody moved a PE file onto the system. So it hasn't even executed yet. But if I start to look and say I've got maybe a date and time, or we're looking at a range that has happened, we might be able to find where something was moved into here. So this is what we have here. Somebody went out. We could maybe see this with PowerShell. In this case, just for sake of the demo, I essentially just went out with Explorer and pulled down or just pulled down a copy of SharpHound. For those who may not know, SharpHound is the actual agent that Bloodhound uses to map Active Directory environments. Very common for threat actors to pull down this type of binary and execute it in the environment to try to map out the easiest attack path into admin, global admin, domain admin level credentials, and understand the environment, identify file shares, all of that. So we have a lot of good data. Again, we've got some SHA values, but this is one of the new things that came out with version 15 is that file executable detected. This didn't run. All I did was download it. So this is really serious visibility when we're looking at, say, command and control, where threat actors are pulling down data and pulling down executables to actually run in your environment. Having something like this, maybe there is an alert for SharpHound. Maybe there is an alert for things that match Cobalt Strike hashes or beacon hashes or other types of post-exploitation tools that you don't want in your environment. You'd easily say, hey, listen, I just want to know where somebody may have downloaded PS exec. It may be a systems admin, but it could also be a problem in the overall scheme of the attack. So, kind of the sake of really looking at different things, the recommendation I would have is look at the different IDs, see what you can see. The other thing is I gave you some atomic red team tests to run, see what those look like. Run the test, see if you can see any activity in in Sysmon, and maybe you got to dial up or dial back your config, but it does give you that type of real serious insight into what's going on the endpoint. So we'll go ahead and wrap it up with just kind of a discussion. There's a couple of examples in the slide deck that I'll be sharing. It goes into a little bit more detail what to look for, but just want to kind of wrap it up, and then we'll leave a couple of minutes for discussion. So as I said, from a digital forensics and incident investigation standpoint, this gives us some real good insight into endpoint behavior. As you saw, we went from, hey, process is created, WMI is executing, this is what WMI is doing in the environment, and this is potentially command and control, and maybe some files, some tools that were downloaded by the threat actors are on the endpoint. Start with other evidence sources, or I should say combine with other evidence sources, and that is where you can start looking at, okay, around this activity, it gives you some, hey, how did they get in? Are they compromising credentials? Are applications running? Are they, maybe system logs will help you, or maybe you need to go into proof of execution like prefetch, amcache, shimcache, or maybe other additional files that were written as part of that. So for example, that sharphound, there may be additional files that are written to the file system as part of that. So again, combined with other evidence sources. Those high probability indicators, something like sharphound doing keyword searches in that spreadsheet, looking for maybe run DLL 32, which is another good one. WMI use, those high probability things that threat actors use a lot are going to stand out when you start doing the triage analysis. As I said, it's very difficult to use this proactively for alerting due to the number of events that you're going to have to be dealing with. I think what I've got right there is 4 or 5 days of activity, and it's 40,000. It was 51 megabytes of data that we actually downloaded as part of that Velociraptor. But that doesn't mean we can't use this. So one of the things I like to say is if you have high value targets, domain controllers, file servers, those kind of things, and you want some visibility on what those are doing, this is a really good one to pull in. Same thing with a honeypot. One of the things I've recommended, it's very tough to see activity in, say, in an environment where you've got a lot of file shares. This may be something where you can use on, say, notional systems or honeypot systems that if anybody interacts with it, tries to run a new process, if you see an event ID from this honeypot, or you see a DNS connection from this honeypot, that may be an alert. So there is the ability to on selected systems to actually leverage this. And that is one of the recommendations I would say. If you can't do one, or you can't do all, do select few that you deem are high value targets, high risk systems, and maybe some deception technology. This is also something to include in any, we talk a little bit about an enterprise forensics and response, about acquisition and analysis plans, playbooks, and workflows. This really is one of those that I would lean heavily on extracting if it's available, extracting in and really kind of diving in. It's kind of the first step into the overall process. So with that being said, I want to thank you. And then I think we've got some time for questions. So I'll pop out of here and
we do. Yeah. So
okay.
One, thank you. I am struggling with copy and paste in the Discord right now, but I'm going to delete this one here real quick, and then we'll get to the questions. For Latter-day Legion, where you're asking the question about the requirements, you're going to want to look at the documentation for the version that you're running. I don't want to pass that one along because I was just doing it as you finish. So we've got tons of questions, but
okay.
Into questions, because we're right at 12:55. In case people have to drop off for their lunch or other meetings, one, Jerry, thank you for doing the webinar. This, I mean, when we get tons of questions like this, and we had close to 800 people viewing at the peak when I saw.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So this was certainly a popular topic. And when we get lots of questions, it means people are really paying attention. So That's awesome. Before we go into questions, though, please join us next week. I just put a link inside of the Discord for Michelle Kahn. You saw them at the beginning during pre-show banter. They're going to be doing the same kind of webcast like this, but on OSINT. And then, Velda, if you wouldn't mind, while I'm going through the questions, putting the Blue Team links and Wild West Hack and Fest links back in there. And yes, for those who are asking about the slides, we're going to have those on the slides channel shortly. So as soon as we're done here, we'll ask Jerry to send those over to us in PDF, and we'll dump them there. So please stick around for Q&A. We're probably going to go a little bit long, so stick around. We'll try and answer as many questions as you can. But if you do have to drop off, again, thank you for joining us for another Anticast. So questions. Let's take a look here. Prashanth Bandi, can we transfer Sysmon logs to a seam? And I think the answer to that is yes, but let's add in a little bit to that. What's kind of is there any tips that you would give to people about configuration for that? Is there anything they need to worry about, size constraints or anything like that?
Yeah. So the first thing that I would say is it's going to be about, as I said, about 14 to 15,000 events per day per system. Is it good? What I would say is fire up a system, let somebody run it, find out how many Sysmon events you have, and then multiply that and kind of come up with an average. What I would say is think about where your visibility is lacking. That's what you want to pull in from Sysmon. So for example, you can't get something that gives you visibility into DNS, and you want DNS records. Okay, that you can actually strip out a config to where all Sysmon does is send you DNS records. It will not log anything else but event ID 22. So what I generally say is if you're going to try to use Sysmon as your primary endpoint visibility tool, you're going to be dealing with a lot of data. It's not impossible, but it is a lot of data. My recommendation would be look at where you may have visibility gaps, and then you can actually craft a config that says, I only want WMI, for example. I just want to see what WMI is doing in my environment. And you can do this for a baselining too. It's to say, I want to see 30 days of WMI activity, so I'm only going to get these three log entries, or these 3 log IDs that give me WMI activity. And then you can go from there. So it's based on the config. You can go grab a config and strip it out and put your own stuff in there, and you ship it out, and it will give you a way to tailor that. So it will ship with Elastic, it'll ship with Splunk, but it's just a matter of how much data you're going to get, because it is very, very loud. It'll tell you exactly what you want to hear.
All right. Very good. Levi Roos, I'm hoping because I got a couple of letters in there, Reuss or Roos or Russ. I'm not on the Discord currently, but I thought Sysmon did start shipping with Windows recently. So we were talking about a lot of Linux, and there was a couple questions about that. Could you deconflict a little bit about the versions and when they went live?
Yeah, so version 15 went live June of 2023. So the latest version, I understand, is it's a systems internal tool. And that you have to install. Mm-hmm. So that's my understanding. And same thing with Linux, is it's not, because of all of the different kernel versions. It is a tool that you have to install. So I don't think, I'm pretty positive that it doesn't ship natively with the Windows platform like all of the other log files that you see.
Okay, excellent. Now, before we wrap up, we're going to go through some more questions. Jerry, can you go a little bit long? Can you?
Yes, absolutely. No, I'll stay for absolutely.
Okay. So for those of you at the top of the hour here, thank you again for joining. Michelle, would you come off camera real quick for me? Because I want to remind folks, or come on camera. I want to remind folks, we put a link in the Zoom and the Discords here. Next week, we will be talking to this fine gentleman about OSINT, so you want to definitely check that out. Anything you want to, like, last notes before folks leave, Michelle, on why they should come to your webcast? And then we'll get back to Q&A.
I can only guarantee you one thing, that your mind will be blown.
Okay. Okay. I don't use this thing much more anyway, so I mean, we might as well just blow it out. That's totally fine. Awesome. Cool. You can stay on video if you'd like, or you can go back up, but I wanted to make sure before people dropped that we get a good reminder to them that come stick around for mind blowing. So let's get back to questions here. Anonymous attendee, would deploying Sysmon still be beneficial if we use Defender ATP or Defender for Endpoint already?
Yes. One of the challenges, what I would say is the ideal scenario, the happy scenario is you deploy Sysmon on as just kind of a check, as just kind of a secondary evidence source. So for example, I use Sharphound. Windows Defender will eat Sharphound. It says, nope, you can't do this. You can't be trusted with Sharphound. You actually have to put in an exception into that. So it'll catch activity like that, where you will get activity with Defender, or miss activity in Defender is if it's a legitimate Windows binary. So for example, if I'm on a system and I see RDP run from Sysmon, and then I see a corresponding RDP event log on an additional system, I'm identifying lateral movement. I've identified lateral movement and I see the network connection. So what it's doing is it's essentially another way, or giving much more visibility, because Sysmon doesn't differentiate between malicious and legitimate. It just says, hey, this is a PE, it ran, I let it run. Whereas Windows Defender is saying, oh, this is a legitimate PE, pass it on, I'm good, I'm looking for malware. So what I would say is, Windows Defender is one of those things that you definitely want to pull into a central monitoring location, whereas Sysmon, you may have to take those 10, 15 minutes to extract those logs and do a quick analysis to figure out what happened. So it's in a happy state, you have something like Defender watching your endpoint, but to get a better sense of what actually happened before and after that Windows Defender event, you'd have to go something like Sysmon, which would give you a much better visibility into it.
Awesome. That I'm actually going to try and jump down here if I can find. No, we'll just go in order. That way it's kind of in order of how the presentation went, because somebody later has a question that essentially relates to that. So
Okay.
Umang Patel, would SCCM or MECM, and I'm going to be honest, I don't know what that is.
That's a new one for me.
Yeah, MECM be the way to go in a corporate Windows environment? So I'm thinking we might need to do some research.
Yeah, I would say SCCM is really good if you don't have it deployed now. What I would say is my ideal, and what I've recommended to organizations, because you will get pushback if you got 2,500 systems. So what we want to turn on Sysmon is to say, I want Sysmon running on all of the endpoints. It doesn't need to be shipped to a central location. So can you make that part of the gold image? Make that part of the image. And then if you don't have it, SCCM or any type of anything that will push out updates or software, that's what you can use in a corporate environment. I wouldn't recommend using Velociraptor as kind of a day-to-day software deployment tool for Sysmon. That's more like, hey, I've got some wonky behavior going on an endpoint. I want to see what it's doing. So yeah, SCCM, Landesk, any one of those that's used for software deployment will be fine with this.
Very good. All right. And we're getting some feedback here from the folks that are on that MEM, Static Tier, and Eric G, thank you. The MEM is the new name for SCCM. Thank you, Microsoft. And I agree with Smithereens, though. It will always be CCM.
Okay, so they changed the name.
Yeah, it's just
so it's no longer, so it's new there, and then it's not Azure Active Directory, it's Azure Entrada ID now or something like that. Is
Marketecture.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm not sure about this one. So Alec Cedrone, and they had pasted a link. I assume while I was answering questions, you had shared a link to Olaf Hartong Sysmon modular on GitHub. Sysmon config with file delete XML, but it's not found. Is that one of the tools you were sharing?
That's weird. It should be up, unless he just recently changed that. So
okay.
I'm going to verify. I'll tell you what. I'll verify the link works.
Okay.
And then change that if I have to in the slide deck, so that everybody has the correct one. That was where I was there. Now, obviously, it just changed, so there could literally be some changes that are coming down the pike. So yeah.
Okay, so can't never could. I love that Discord name, by the way. The phishing payload would eventually traverse the network and egress the perimeter firewall. Could we just put a Sysmon box before the perimeter firewall? Pulling Sysmon data from every endpoint requires larger space, etc. So how do you feel about that, using Sysmon kind of at the perimeter to look at that kind of stuff?
You know what? That would be something I'd have to dig into. What I would say is most modern firewalls are probably, if they're doing deep packet inspection, that's where the best way to do it is from file payloads, because Sysmon is going to give you the essentially the DNS query at the top level of the URI. It's not going to give you all, like, so if it's just a straight up NS1 domains.com, you don't know what the URI is, so you'd actually have to go out and figure out where that payload is coming from, unless, so here's what you would see is you would see that DNS query, and then shortly thereafter, say a file like an executable on the file system, and then go pivot from there. So I don't know. That's an interesting thought to do that, because I don't necessarily know if it's actually in that it works in line like that, because this activity has to take place on the endpoint. And that is, it has to touch the file system or the endpoint or something like that versus being inline. So I don't have a good answer for that. I think that might be something to look at. It'd be a good con presentation.
Yeah. So you don't need to go back and look at GitHub. The link was found. Thank you, Smithereens, for pasting that. I also put it in the chat. So it looks like either that was being updated or there was some sort of link update that needs to happen there. So very good. Autograph 2020 Wuzza versus Velociraptor. Which is best?
That's like what's the best pizza, pepperoni or meatball? If I am looking to do I'll put it this way: Velociraptor for me is easier to set up. And honestly, it is one of those tools that you can set up in the middle of an incident and get it to work. So that is one of the things that I would say is kind of what it was the big advantage for me. I've played with, but you still run into the same issue. Wuzza is going to give you a lot more of that EDR-ish feel in terms of how you interact with the system. I think of it as Velociraptor is a great evidence extraction and analysis tool, and it also does some hunting. Other options, even just something like OS Query will give you some, but if you're looking for like an EDR, more of an EDR tool, yeah, Wuzza I think is going to be a little bit better in that regard. That's a really good question, though, because I think there's a use case. You're looking at maybe 2 to 3 different use cases where one is stronger than the other.
Gotcha. Yeah, no, yeah, there's a lot of discussion in the chat, but what about pineapple on pizza? What about, how do you?
Who said pineapple on pizza? Kick him out.
Well, they were just asking a question. Which one is pineapple on pizza?
There's nothing that compares to the horror that is pineapple on pizza. So I would probably say, okay, I'm going to throw somebody on the McAfee EPO.
All right, very good. I'm going to jump because this one came in and it is kind of related. The rules that you showed, especially the ones in that link that we found, the rules there, are they written in a way that can be used in either Velociraptor or Wuzza, or is it just Velociraptor that they work best with?
Velociraptor is what they're going to work best with. Yeah.
Okay. Very good.
I should do a Wuzza and do a compare contrast. You guys are giving me some ideas here.
That would be great.
Yeah, that would be a really interesting one.
That's not an area I play in a lot. I would personally want to watch that webcast.
Yeah.
All right. Let's take a look here. Moving through, Yehuda, I believe that is there a standard way of looking at Sysmon logs if you don't use Velociraptor? Now, I know you looked at the event viewer, but what would you recommend?
So my recommendation is Event Log Explorer, and what I would do is get the free version for 30 days and play with it. What Event Log Explorer, and it's I forget the name of it. It's about $100 a year, and it is a much better tool set because you have a lot more functionality with how you configure the data to look at it. So, for example, you can get column configs that just remove the system ID because you don't need it. It's some of these things that you just don't need. I just need to see the event ID and what it's doing. Maybe date and time is a good one. My standby, though, is Excel or LibreOffice, the spreadsheet program, because it will eat 50,000 lines very easily, and I can use a find function. I can remove columns that I don't need, and I can parse data and sort data fairly easily. So that is kind of my two go-tos if I don't have something. The other thing you can do, and I didn't really, you have like 18,000 things you want to share, and it's like you just keep running out of time, is to actually use, you can take that CSV and open it up in Timeline Viewer, the Eric Zimmerman tool Timeline Viewer, and actually view those by time. That's another option. So those are kind of the three that I like. Even if Event Viewer gets you by, but the ability to hammer on keywords, Event Log Explorer will allow you to hammer on keywords. You may be able to, with the spreadsheet, if I just want to say, hey, run DLL32 bypass is a common technique. Let me see if I see any, it'll show up.
So I'm going to jump to another question here, and we're gonna wrap up in about 5 minutes here. So if we don't get to your questions, Jerry, I'll forward them. I'll just kind of dump them in Discord, and if you want to answer them,
okay, sure,
later, we'll do that. But I we'll go a little bit over. But one question that was asked that I do want to jump to, because we like to talk about these things. Rob Dalton. Is Jerry doing a course soon? Well, yes, he is. And Belda already responded to you, but for those who are in there, yeah, he's got a course coming up at the Blue Team Summit. And so we'll put that link again back into Zoom. It was in Discord as well. But yeah, enterprise forensics and response. So definitely check that out if you're hearing all this and going, I want to hear more from this guy, which you probably should. All right, so moving on back to these questions here. Okay, we did that one. You did, so you did again. So Velociraptor's open source seam that also helps deploy. Now, that's not how I've always understood it, but how would you describe Velociraptor?
So Velociraptor, I would say, is a incident response tool. So the best way to look at Velociraptor is it is an agent-based evidence acquisition, and I would say moderately good analysis tool. The two major points that you get with Velociraptor is the ability to immediately pivot into a system and start doing analysis, and to isolate the system too. So it is kind of got some EDR functionality. It doesn't process alerts. There are well, I shouldn't say no, because there's a lot of work that has gone into, and there are abilities to ping off specific indicators and those. So it's kind of hard to classify as one or the other. I would put it in the endpoint detection and response tools with very light detection, more evidence acquisition and analysis, and the ability to pivot into multiple systems across the enterprise. So I'll give you a real quick use case that you don't see with SIM is I see a specific hash in Sysmon. I can actually pivot off that hash into other systems and send it out to other systems and say, okay, which systems are seeing this hash file? And that's where the hunt functionality of Velociraptor comes in.
Gotcha. All right. So, I was answering questions. I was like, I don't know the answer to that. Does anonymous attendee, does Linux have event IDs? And I think what they mean is, are there event IDs that are corollary to Windows event IDs?
No, I think I think that the Linux, and I could be wrong here, the Linux are separated based on, they have a very similar nomenclature, but it's going to be Linux specific. So, the way that, and I could be kind of going off base here, but the way that the Linux works, and I'd have to do a little bit more research because it's a really good question, is it's based on so you may see event ID process created, but it's not going to give you the same information that you're going to get from a Windows Sysmon event log, but it's not going to be a one-to-one match, but they're going to be very similar look and feel.
Awesome. All right, last couple questions here, and like I said, we might not get through all of these. New question here from Just Ben. Seems like there's a lot of work to read through syslog, go through, convert them. Is there an easier way? I think we've talked about that at this point. We had timeline explorer and a couple of those. Okay, very good. Will this work in a cloud environment with fully remote endpoints?
Absolutely. You can do this in anything that's running, anything that will support, for example, what I showed. So if you're in Azure, you can do this on your Azure endpoints. Now, I have not yet gone ahead and see what you get in terms of pulling this into Sentinel, for example. But if you're running Sysmon on endpoints in Azure, you can do this, and you can actually deploy the agents from Velociraptor. It's one of the things I show as part of the training course is you can run Velociraptor anywhere. You can run it in your own Azure environment, access it through the web console, and do all of this work remotely. So that a definite yes, all of this that we looked at.
Awesome. Unfortunately, I'm going to jump to one last question because it's one that I think is probably, in my mind, the most interesting. Where to go? Oh, it's most interesting, and then I'm like, which one? Where was it? Remote. It was very. Sorry. I'm sorry. I'm struggling. Oh my gosh. There we go. It was from an anonymous attendee. But what I struggle with, and you kind of ended on it, or so you mentioned at some point that, hey, this is only going to tell you what's happening, not why. I think what it was, but it says, what I struggle with is telling what's malicious and what isn't. Any tips on that? And I know that's like, well, it's been 20 years in information security, but are there any primers or guides or something you might point people to say, here's an area where you can learn about problematic Sysmon logs?
So, I'll kind of tell you. So, full disclosure, I work for the company. So, Red Canary's threat detection report gives you the top 10 techniques that are used and the actual atomic red team tests. This can easily be executed, and I actually give you in the actual slides the actual tests that I use to run this. And then what you do is run Sysmon, execute the test. Carrie. And her last name is completely
Roberts.
Thank you. Woo. Carrie Roberts does a lot with this too. Get involved with Atomic Red Team, because that way you can control what's bad. And I mean that in a good way. You're like, literally, I know this is bad if I can see this. So for example, WMI activity like that. That's what you should be seeing. So Atomic Red Team IO is where Atomic Red Team IO, get on the Slack channel if you can. Carrie Roberts training is some of the best out there. I think it's one of the best. There's a lot of free resources with that. That is the best way to learn because it's free-ish, meaning you got to put some time into it. It's free like a puppy, but it is one of the best ways to know what is bad and actually then go through the log files and see if you can find what's bad. The best part about it is you know exactly when and where you executed it. And you know exactly what you should, what generally where you should be looking in the logs, and then you can see what's bad and what's good. And that's a very excellent question, because it is one of the toughest parts about this is, for example, if I see command prompt running run DLL 32, that's bad. Nobody does that. I don't know sysadmins that do that. There may be some, I've not met one, but I know that that's bad. PS exec running, I know that's bad. It's again, experience, but also going through those atomic tests and going, okay, this is what an actual execution of run DLL 32, opening up calculator, what it looks like, and this is what the log entries look like.
Very cool. All right, so there are a ton of questions here, and unfortunately we can't get to all of them. For those of you who stuck around for the extra 18 minutes, thank you so much for the 408 folks. Velda and Caleb, and Michelle, would you come back on for us? Because I'm going to capture the rest of these questions and get them over into Discord, and when we get the slides up there, Jerry, if you can take a look at them and if you can answer some, that'd be great. But Velda, can you just quickly remind us real quick the Blue Team Summit, Wild West Hackin' Fest, we got Carrie Roberts classes that were just talked about, we got Michelle, just give us a quick reminder of the links that you've dumped in and what people can check out.
Sure. This is a reminder. We have Blue Team Summit coming up August 23rd with training on the 24th and 25th. Jerry's will be one of those. Carrie is also offering a pay what you can training. We have Wild West Hacking Fest coming up at the end, mid-October, October 17th and 18th for pre-conference training. Michelle will be part of that. And then we have the conference itself on the 18th through the 20th, and Jerry will be speaking with us there. So you have 2 more opportunities to see Jerry. And then we have the webcast, of course, next week with Michelle. So lots of great things coming up. But don't forget to check out our website in general, just because we have lots of really fun, exciting things happening on both the Anti-Siphon and the Wild West Hacking Fest websites.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And like you heard, I'm just going to paste in here again. Your next opportunity to kind of hang out with us and hear what's going on is really next Thursday with Michelle, and find out more about their Anti-Siphon training class and OSINT, have your mind blown. So with that said, Jerry, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Quite amazing. Thank you from myself, Ian Meyer, from Felda, Michelle, Caleb, everyone at Anti-Siphon Training, Noah, who had to drop off, and of course, from all your friends here at BHS. Thank you for joining us again for another Anti-Siphon Anti-Cast, and we will see you on the next one. And since Ryan is not on, I guess I have to burn it with fire. So I will go through and burn it down. We're ending the stream, and let's end here. Thanks, everybody.